I knew, for example, any group of people who wake up at 8:30 in the morning on the third day of the conference and come up to listen to the plenary is a very special cohort. So thank you for making this effort. So let me just go back to, So the ICPD Program of Action, as explained to by Stan, and the elements and the principles and the issues that are covered, it is not only covered in the ICPD Program of Action. Governments across the world have committed to this in all of these various forums that have existed, agreements, international conventions, and this is a grand list of some of those conventions, right? And the Program of Action put women's empowerment and autonomy at the center of development and shifted the paradigm from demographically driven population control goals to a human rights-based approach promoting women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. You know, and the Asia-Pacific region makes up about 61% of the world's population. And the region is, as you know, if you go in all of the circles, is touted as a success story in terms of having been able to curb the population explosion, to reap the demographic dividend, and to develop economically. And so this is sometimes, you know, when forces perhaps outside of the region, you know, whether it is the United Nations, whether it's donor agencies, they look at our region and they think that the ICPD agenda, especially if they are kind of demographically motivated, have already been achieved because the agenda of fertility reduction has been achieved. But the ICPD Program of Action was far more than that. It was an agenda of achieving and ensuring equality, equity, and well-being, especially for the vulnerable and marginalized groups of women. And poverty, as we know, is still the key development issue after all of these years, you know. So despite numerous commitments to poverty reduction, poverty eradication, zero tolerance for poverty, and despite extensive economic gains, the outcomes are not reflected in the distribution of wealth. You know, when we consider the stories of this rapid economic growth that our region has, you know, enjoyed, I mean, the glittering towers that we see, the beautiful luxury cars, the luxury stores, the casinos, we've seen a number of those in Manila, you know, it is really remarkable to contrast and compare it with the fact that the region hosts more than 900 million of the world's poor. And a significant proportion of these people are suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and a very high proportion of people lack access to even basic sanitation facilities. So, and in the new, in the processes that, you know, Stan has talked about, the dimension of inequality, so it is no longer just, you know, the developed countries versus the developing countries, but even within developing countries, we have seen these dimension of inequalities. And the pace of poverty reduction is slow mainly because of these inequalities that have emerged. And the worst impact has been experienced by the South and Southwest Asia sub-region, which accounts for 44% of the world's poor. Inequalities in the region are growing, and income inequality in the Asia-Pacific is like the highest in the world, you know, and we record Gini coefficients which are higher than more than 50% of what is recorded by the OECD countries, and so a commitment within our region to achieve socio-economic equality is definitely one of the forefront agendas. And this is why, you know, we have the haves and the rest who have nuts, okay, according to this cartoon. So another thing which is very important is gender inequality. Right, so, oops, going very fast. Okay. So gender inequalities and gender power imbalances also continue to remain a formidable barrier to achieving equality, equity, and well-being. And in this region it has already been talked about that it is rooted and perpetuated by son preference and male dominance in socio-cultural practices throughout the region. Whether it is access to food, water, education, toilets, health services, land, housing, citizenship. Women still continue to be second-class citizens, whether or not they are living in democracies, whether they're living in more socialist societies, or even theocratic states. So they're all just dimensions of being second-class citizens across this range of political scenarios. The movement to achieve bodily integrity, and whether it is freedom from harassment, rape, or reproductive autonomy, is just beginning. And also for women, the movement to become recognized as beings with agency, especially sexual agency, which is very much a taboo topic in our culture in the region, is also just beginning. And the movement to becoming recognized as beings who are not only objects of desire and pleasure, but as beings who desire and who seek pleasure is also beginning. And so the big question is, are we equal? And are we anywhere near being equal? So, now the other part of this topic that was given to us was to talk about some of the emerging issues and some of the re-emerging issues. And perhaps what has changed quite a great deal from the previous years where these international documents were agreed upon in a consensus way amongst member states is that today, the global political scenario is more polarized scenario than ever before. And the North-South divide on what should be the next MDGs or the SDGs is reflective of this. And previously, when it was about a question of, rights versus not having rights, what we are actually seeing is a clash of rights, and which rights will supersede, each other. And this is why it makes the battle all the more tougher and more difficult. Okay? So, for example, if we look at, the issues of environment, which Stan talked about, it is very much, done as the right to development versus the right to environment for future generations, conveniently and perhaps crudely interpreted by some countries as this, right? And in turn, retaliated to by governments in the South as not having the right to develop at all, right? And what happens in this division that occurs, this divide, when this divide happens in the discourse, it masks the actual situation. Regions continue to remain adversely affected by the impact of climate change. For example, 45% of the world's natural disasters occurring in the Asia-Pacific region in the last 3 decades, and more than 200 million people in the region have been affected, which comprises of 90% of the world's total. And we've seen all of them. We've seen earthquakes, we've seen floods, we've seen extreme temperatures, storms. The Philippines itself experienced Typhoon Haiyan, and of course the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami affected 14 countries in the region and left in its wake an estimated 230,000 people dead and 1.69 million people displaced. And at the same time, what you can see is it also marks the very big divide on how women's and men's bodies should be used and to what purposes and what ends. And very often what these discourses are saying is that it's very often determined by priorities other than the rights of individuals to freely choose and decide. So the second emerging trend that I'd like to talk about is migration. And generally, I'm going to try to avoid showing you slides which has got a lot of text because you'll try to read it, and it is migration is complex and is determined by both economic and political factors. Migration can be temporary, it can be permanent, forced, voluntary, internal, external, and forced movement includes displacement due to natural, environmental, or climate change-induced disasters, wars, internal conflicts, famine, development projects including, and an estimated 214 million migrants. This is the size of the 5th most populous country in the world. This is the size of the numbers of people that we are talking about. And 49% of these migrants are women. And interestingly enough, what you will see is that access to equal citizenship, especially for external migrants, is a challenge. And in a depth review which we have done in Arrow, we have found that almost approximately 60 governments have established health screening procedures, often discriminatory, and violate migrant rights upon application, arrival, and renewal of work permits. And many developed countries in Asia and the Middle East that rely on migrant workers to keep their economy going have instituted migration policies that use health as a primary criteria for permitting migrants entry and staying up to for employment. And under these policies, migrants are being screened for up to 22 conditions and diseases, including pregnancy and HIV, and sexual and reproductive health and rights in the context of migration is made even more invisible. And in many contexts, we would consider all of this a violation of reproductive rights and a violation of sexual rights. However, when it comes, to dealing with the foreigners in our midst, we are somehow not so, we don't seem to be so on guard in defending those rights. Now, the third emerging trend is the protracted financial crisis, resulting in austerity measures. And I think in 2013, a report came out. It was called The Age of Austerity, which looked at public expenditure and both in budgets and across a number of policies that were instituted by governments after the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And what it showed was that many governments are actually undertaking austerity measures at a level that has not been anticipated, despite previously recommended economic prescriptions which asked to step up spending rather than to embark on austerity measures. Now, what is particularly relevant to us is that this exacerbates already existing trend of privatization, especially of the health services. Additionally, when there's a resource crunch, it is a social sector spending that experiences budgetary cuts, and as a result, only a limited or narrow scope of tax-funded government health services, especially sexual and reproductive health services, are offered, and people are often driven to seek necessary services from private providers. These expenses, often out of pocket, prove catastrophic, especially for the poor, and governments have been experimenting with prepayment schemes, conditional cash transfers, vouchers, micro-insurance schemes, social franchising, and public and private partnerships. And as we are working towards, a cost-effective, efficient model of the healthcare system, what we need to ask is, are governments introducing these measures in their countries as a long-term public welfare benefit for a certain marginalized group, or are they introducing it as a medium-term behavioral change mechanism policy? And this is something that we need to be very wary of before we advocate for these schemes that have been introduced. So the private services, has grown dramatically increased, and the public sector has shrunk so much that, you know, the divide is another issue of unequal resources being put to these. So the third was, you know, the idea of poverty amidst plenty, and the right to food, food security, and food sovereignty is a fundamental rights issues. And many people in our region, despite having countries that have enjoyed economic growth, you know, continue to suffer from hunger and malnutrition, which is a travesty on many accounts, you know, I mean, for me especially. Now, and of course, you talk about the Global Hunger Index and everything. So I just want to talk about the last one, which is the final re-emerging trend, which is religious extremism. And its renewed battle against women's rights masked within the discourse of cultural, traditional, and religious rights. So all of the rights that were considered universal for women, we have recently learned that actually is adapted according to culture. And women only have those rights if their culture or their religion permits them to have. And all of these rights are negotiable according to different countries. And while we can look and say that this is, you know, a loony fringe which has championed this idea and run away from the idea of universalism of human rights, we have to also ask ourselves a critical question: why has this occurred? Why, after all of these years, has religion become more appealing? And there are many reasons and, you know, theories that have been posited. One, of course, is, you know, the answer that religion gives a form of identity, which, you know, a specific identity in this era of globalization, which makes it so attractive. But we also need to say that because the idea of the secular state, and for us it's very simple, you know, secular means, you know, the separation of church and state. But in the minds of many people, the secular state means also the business enterprise, the economic capitalist system, which has, you know, brought about all of these inequalities, you know, because it is, you know, for academicians and researchers and scholars, it is easy to understand the nuances. But if you're living from a daily wage to another daily wage, it is not, you do not have the mind space, because you're just struggling for survival to do this analysis and understand that whether you have a theocratic state or whether you have a secular state, you are undoubtedly, you know, going to suffer the same, you know, oppressive system. So I think that we never imagined that in this day and age we would see the lure of religion becoming far more powerful, you know, and they have a fantastic advocate in the newest Pope who seems to be, you know, has seized the imagination of the world, you know. So this is something that we really need to consider, you know, when we are considering strategies of putting forward our agenda for an equal vision for everyone. You know, so we really need to strategize very carefully. So, and the last part of my talk today talks about prospects. So this is what they say: challenges and prospects. And I like the idea of prospects, right? And every time we go into all of these NGO meetings and then we talk about this, you know, we talk about the neoliberal economic system, we talk about food insecurity, you talk about migration, you talk about, you know, the 99% and the 1%, and then we think, is it really possible to make the change that we want to see in the world? So the first image I'd like to show you is this. We're the little guy and we're trying to fight this big guy, right? But we must understand, you know, even when the odds are stacked against us, and even when the opponent looks so completely, you know, so strong and so secure and, you know, cannot be brought down, you know, we must understand there's always an inherent advantage we hold. And our inherent advantage is the fact that if you're small, we're agile, we're adept, we can adapt very easily, we can run circles around them and confuse them. And this is how the small guy always wins. You know, so there is an inherent advantage, so let's not always think it's the big guy who wins. And always, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? So the second one I wanted to tell you was, and I take it like, you know, from the first plenary, is that people want change. There is, for the first time, the issues of inequality, of democracy. What does it mean to have the freedom of speech? What does it mean to be an equal citizen? It's a discourse that is coming up in every single country. So the people remember it, and the people, yearn for change, and this yearning for change is in the air. And this is a global phenomenon, and this is definitely, linked with the principles of, the movement that we are members of. And we should know how to kind of link ourselves with these lines of resistance that are being drawn up every day, regardless of whether it is being funded or not. There are so many creative initiatives taking place at so many levels across the world, So I think that, this is something that we have to remember. This thing either is not moving or moves too fast for me. Okay. So, and then we also have to remember that building movements, building coalitions that are truly representative of the issues of the people is essential about bringing the change that we want to create in our world. We ourselves have forgotten our power. What is our power of the non-governmental organizations that we all come from? We are the ones who hold governments accountable. We have diverse movements of young people, women, aged people, disabled people, poverty movements, right to food movements, migration movements. We hold governments accountable. We question power. We question the uses and misuses of power. And this is what, we have forgotten, that this is where our true power lies. And we have to remember that this is where our true power lies. And I think that this started when, we stopped calling ourselves non-governmental organization and we called ourselves civil society because, we're really not civil society. We are uncivil society. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that we have to leverage technology, and I agree with Stan, social media today puts pressure, mocks, makes fun of governments and political leaders in a way that has never been seen in the world, right? And it is simultaneously an organizing tool, a monitoring tool, a tool to provide thought leadership, a tool to unite and build communities. And hence, this tool is available to all of us, and I think that part of the future, is definitely so much, the change that we want to create is going to be created through the use of social media. And on the last slide, Roger, okay, that always remember that another world is possible, and as Arundhati Roy says, she's on the way. And if you listen very, very carefully, you can hear her breathe. Thank you.